Okay. Okay, this is kind of where we left off last Thursday as we finished up talking about defense mechanisms. And this is something from, again, the psychoanalysis that really has continued. There's been good research on them. And so, there's even expanded lists of these in some treatment modalities. They call them thinking errors. But again, the thing that I want to wrap up on this is I would encourage you to take a look at this list and start to identify them when you're using them and when other people are using them. And remember that when we see these things, especially if they escalate, us as the facilitator need to stop and really figure out what's going on in that group that is making certain individuals go into a repression or a regression state. Okay, so again, this is kind of that skill development part that I'd encourage you to continue on and do um, in practice. Okay, so the next theory that I want to kind of talk about in this introductory part is something known as humanistic approach. Okay. Now, if I were to explain pure humanistic therapy in and of itself, the pure form of it, it would be that stereotypical what you kind of see on sitcoms where the person goes in and they tell them what's going on, and the therapist just sits there and says, "Continue telling me how you're feeling. What are you thinking about? Why do you think you felt that way?" And the person in the sitcom ends up getting frustrated because the therapist never gives them their professional opinion. They just continue asking the client to explore what's going on their own level. Okay. So it's kind of that if you watch a sitcom where the therapist never gives a interpretation of the client's state of being, that's called pure humanistic therapy or treatment. Okay. Now, in most modalities of treatment, the humanistic approach isn't really used in its entirety, but it is used in most treatment settings to establish the therapeutic relationship between the provider and the client. Okay. So in most treatment, most therapies, most therapists will start with this approach. But then as the relationship has developed between them and the client, and as their change is identified for the individual, and then we use a more formalized type of treatment, such as cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR or something like that, to then put in a treatment regimen. Okay. Um, but just to kind of give some of the qualities of the humanistic approach. It stresses the difference between this and, say, Freudian theory or cognitive behavioral theory is it stresses the person's capacity for personal growth. Okay. That we have the ability to choose our destination and where we're going in life and focus on positive human qualities. Okay. Probably the most important part of humanistic theory is they feel that each individual already has a capacity to solve the problems. It's our job to find those answers within them. Okay. And again, that's why I mentioned the pure humanistic approach is you don't really, as the therapist, give your interpretation. You don't give them really in the most purest form. You don't even give them a diagnosis of something. Um, and so, but again, again, for the purposes of this class, what I want you to focus on This approach is used to establish the client professional relationship. Okay. Um, and again, the reason why this one is important in an introduction to helping kind of a lecture is that this is one of the few theories, maybe, there's existential theory and whatnot, and a few others that actually believe that you have the free will to choose and determine your behaviors. Okay. You can make the decision to change. When we look at Freudian theory, it's in behavioral theories and stuff like that they're all deterministic theory. Okay. In the Freudian theory that we talked about Thursday, you don't choose your behaviors. It's the processes in your unconscious mind that set you up to behave in a given way. In behaviorism and behavioral belief, you don't choose your behaviors. You behave by a history of reward and punishment for the behaviors that you're committing today. So they would say you are here in college because you were conditioned to eventually get to college and go through college and do those things. You didn't choose it though. Okay. The importance, I think, especially in treatment, is giving the person the ability to believe in choice, in that I can change, and then use a behavioral or a cognitive or something else approach to help them get to that point. Okay. So let's take a look at uh, Brittany. You have your hand up if you're okay being recorded.
Um, Sorry, I just wanted to go ahead and clarify real quick. So humanistic approach basically is where they find the answer within themselves. The one we learned last week is it's already chosen for us type of thing.
Yeah, so the difference between maybe it'll be more clear as I go through Maslow's theory here to kind of see the differences. But yeah, so with Freudian and psychoanalysis, your behaviors are determined by unconscious processes that you don't necessarily have control over. Your ego, right? Is not even what we're consciously aware of, that the ego in Freudian theory is just determining the best way to be you should behave to be socially appropriate, to be to get through life good, but still satisfying those unconscious urges. Okay. For humanistics theory, and maybe will let me give this explanation of where humanistic theory grew out of. Okay, and we're going to use Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. I had to think of their names because they are really the start of humanistic theory. Okay, and humanistic theory grew out of a philosophy known as existentialism, which was really popular in the 1950s and 1960s when humanistic theory really started to develop. Okay. Because in the 1950s and even 1940s, well, let's say this 1940s through the 1960s. Let's use those dates. It looked like the world was going to burn. We did World War II, which was one of the deadliest wars. We were here in the United States. We were part of several different conflicts with Vietnam and whatnot, and we went through the civil rights era. We were in the midst of a Cold War. I don't know if any of you are of age, but I remember in elementary school having nuclear bomb drills instead of fire drills in school. And it looked like the world was pretty um, gone. And so this existential theory really became really took off because what existential theory is states is that we're born into a meaningless, chaotic world, in a meaningless universe that is just randomly orbiting around a sun like our Earth, and there's really no meaning in it. So because we're born meaningless, we create meaning. So we create religions, schools, government, jobs, and we give those things meaning and definition, and um, uh, that's kind of why things exist. Um, but within this theory, because we are born into a meaningless world, that means we have free will. We have the ability to make decisions and change our who we are and what we believe in and everything else. If we didn't have free will, we'd probably all have one religion, one government, it wouldn't be what it is for people to be able to choose what they affiliate with and what they don't affiliate with because we create that meaning within ourselves. Okay. So that's really the basis of existentialism. When it translates into humanistic theory, they believe that people are motivated to understand who they are as a complete person. That what we're really aiming towards in life is to understand who we are as human beings, as individuals. And this is, in Maslow's term, the term of self-actualization. Okay. But let's kind of rehearse what Maslow stated in order to get to that to the ability to become self-actualized. Okay. What and this probably looks familiar to a lot of people either from Psych 101 or classes, or I heard someone is doing groups and they probably have heard of this, this is Maslow's pyramid of needs. Okay. And what he argued is that in order for a person to be self-actualized, they have to have all of these needs in alignment, meaning we need to have these taken care of so that we can truly reflect on us as a human being, who we are, and create that movement. Okay. Um, and this is why, though, a lot of people don't actually become self-actualized. Okay. But to explain that, let me go through each one of these. Our first and most basic need are our physiological needs. So this is food, water, warmth, rest, and the like, those things that biologically sustain us. So this is, in essence, things like a paycheck, work, that provide these needs as well. Okay. And then we need to feel safe where we're at. We need to, not have violence in our home. We need to live in a safe neighborhood. We need to be around safe people. And then we have to have some belongingness and love in our life. We have to have good intimate relationships, good friendships, healthy acquaintance with our family at the least. And we need to have kind of what I call our tribe, our people, our in where we're at. Okay, who are your people, in a sense. And then we need to feel good about ourselves. We have to have esteem needs. We have to have good self-esteem and whatnot, and really have those. And when these things are in place, then we can become self-actualized. Okay. So I want to pause here for just a minute and just make some analogies to what we do in work in this pyramid of needs. For those who are going into social work, and even for those who are going into just the basics of social services, or into even developing treatment plans and everything else, these are the things that we assess if you think about a good psychosocial assessment. Okay. So usually when a person comes into our center, we see if they have their food, shelter, all of those taken care of. We ask about physical disorders like diabetes or heart disease, all of those things that physically affect the person. Okay. Then we ask, are they safe? Do they have violence in the home? Uh, Gang affiliation, neighborhood issues, and we help them with their safety and security needs. Then we ask them about their relationships. Do they have a support system? Who do they go to when they're having a problem? Do they have someone to go to? What is the state of their intimate relationships and family relationships? And even in social work, we go beyond this because we do genealogy things with clients and really look at the connection between the individual and their social world. And then we assess their esteem. So maybe we give a depression questionnaire. We ask about anxiety. We ask about their self-esteem, how they feel about themselves. And these are all the elements of a really good psychosocial assessment. Okay. And are elements of pretty much all of them. Because again, the idea is if we have these things in place, then we're able to achieve this feeling of self-actualization. We get to really deeply explore ourselves. Okay. So let's take this now to the group setting. Okay. And why in a group we do like check-ins, like maybe at the start of the group, we ask everyone how their week went. Can they give some examples of what they did this last week and how they're doing? And we keep it really open-ended. The purpose behind those check-in questions or those introductory questions that I want you all to focus on now is in the back of our minds, we should be assessing um, when group members bring up issues. Okay, so maybe a group member said they got kicked out of their house. Well, here we have an issue. Maybe someone had a domestic violence issue, so this person has this. Maybe this one, their friends are trying to talk them out of going to treatment. Maybe this person maybe had a loss that now is affecting their esteem needs. And as group facilitators, we need to be paying attention to those things because all of these issues are going to prevent the client from really exploring themselves on that individual level during the group. So we have to address these in some way and help the client kind of balance themselves to then get through the rest of the group. And sometimes you can use this in mature groups by saying, hey, group, can we discuss different ways we can take care of, physiological needs, those kinds of things. If it's a new group, it may be just exploring it and helping them feel it's okay because they're in a safe place, safe spot at that moment. Okay. But those are all things that in the back of your mind when you do group introductions or check-ins and stuff, these are kind of the things that you should be checking off in your mind and whether they're going to be something that really will prevent the person from being openly engaged in the group process. Okay. All right. I want to uh, bring up the definition that I really like for self-actualization that kind of gives it some more of a concrete um, um, definition is the one that Carl Rogers used. Okay. Carl Rogers developed this notion of what he called the ideal self versus the real self. Okay. The ideal self is the person you think you ought to be. So, straight A student, first to work, mother, father of the year, um, rock star, uh, actor, social media influencer. So they're all the things that you feel that you should be. And the real self is the actual person that is existing in the world right here. Okay, that is here, that is acting and behaving in the world. Okay, if we what Rogers said is that a lot of dysfunction comes from the distance between who we think we ought to be, the ideal self, and who we really are as human beings. Okay. And what he argued is that self-actualization is when the ideal self and the real self are one in the same. Now, this doesn't mean you become the ideal self. What it is getting to this point where you have really accepted all of your positive qualities, everything you do right, and you continue to work on those, but you completely accept all your bad qualities, all your bad habits, all your, if you do negative thinking, all of those things that maybe you're a procrastinator, any of those different things that, but you accept that with yourself because until you accept it, you can't change it. Okay. So your ideal self and real self become one and the same. They're the same exact thing through accepting everything good and bad about yourself. Okay. And this will become important here in just a minute when creating the therapeutic relationship. But I will say, is there something to this ideal self, real self kind of thing? In research, we have found that the greater distance between a client's ideal self and their real self, the more dysfunction or more severe symptomology we see. So we see that depression is worse, anxiety is worse. This research definitely has been very influential in ideas dealing with eating disorders and a bunch of different of those emotional stress disorders. Okay. And we do find that the closer we can get a client between who they think they ought to be and who they are, we see symptoms be reduced within a population. So there is something to be said when it comes to dysfunction when there is too much space between who a person really is and who they think they ought to be. Okay. So something to think about. But where does this come into now the client professional relationship? And this is again going off of Carl Rogers' theory, a person-centered theory. Okay. That when you walk into a treatment setting, you are now a participant in it. And it's now going to become part of your life narrative, but it shouldn't be about you. It should be about that human relationship you have with that person, and that it's about the person and what they're going through, and not really about what you're going through. Okay. So there's some kind of terms that we should talk about really quick. So one is the notion of self-concept, an individual's overall perception and assessment of their abilities, behaviors, and personality. Okay. So understanding how a client views themselves and views what's going on in their life is precedent over anything else. One of the things that we will talk about when we get to the going into these skills in more depth is sometimes as therapists and even group facilitators, we become what I call social voyeurs, meaning that we sometimes will ask questions that have no therapeutic end, but the therapist is just curious about it. Okay, I dealt with this a lot when supervising therapists who were giving treatment to adults and children who have went through sexual abuse. Is they would unnecessarily ask the client to recall specific things that happened during the an assault or during the abuse, which really has no therapeutic purpose or value. Okay. Um, and but they would ask the question because they were curious. Another instance where therapists kind of make a mistake, there's a social voyeur part, but then therapists tend to want to become investigators instead of therapists. So they ask their client questions to see if it matches what, again, going back to my example, going back to what law enforcement said or what other people are saying about the event that happened. Okay. Which again is going from a therapist to an investigator. We're not investigators. We are not law enforcement. We are not private investigators. We are therapists. And in the beginning phases of treatment, especially, we have to get to the point that we accept what our clients are saying as their lived factual life. That what they have constructed in their mind about what they've gone through is their reality. And we have to do what's this next term from Carl Rogers states is unconditional positive regard, accepting the values and being positive towards another person's behaviors and emotions. And this is where, again, I'm going back to his ideal self versus real self. And another thing I would encourage you to work on is coming to a complete acceptance of who you are as a human being. And that includes not denying bad habits, bad thoughts, bad thinking. You have to accept all of those. Okay. Because the hard part about unconditional positive regard is that if we don't accept ourselves completely, we cannot accept another person completely. We deny their humanity when it insults our, what I'm going to call ego at this point. Okay. And until, oh, I just lost my train of thought. So unconditional positive regard is coming from an individual who has complete acceptance for themselves and therefore can completely accept others. Now, let me give you some literal examples of this. Is that it's being able to see, for example, if you're working with prison populations. If you go into a prison and all you see is a criminal, you're never going to help those people. You're just going to perpetuate that behavior. But if you go into a prison and you recognize, yes, this person did a crime, but they also are a mother, a father, a daughter, a son, employee, all of those kinds of things. I always thought about this when I worked in a women's prison. Is yes, there were women in there. They committed a crime. That was what they did. But then when I observed them at visitation, for example, some of them were wonderful mothers, very caring, kind, attentive, all of those kind of things. So here's a conflict. person is in prison criminal, and according to standards of law, they are a bad person. They needed to be separated. But now here they are in a parenting role, and they're doing amazing. Well, if you haven't come to where you accept your good and bad qualities, you're going to ignore those qualities of that individual and only pay attention to their negative aspect and assume that they're not going to grow and develop until they accept that. Okay, so that's something I want you to think about as you approach the treatment setting and the group setting is, are you at a point where you can completely accept yourself and everything else and really go into a setting unbiasedly? Okay. And again, later on, when we talk about these skills a little bit more, I'm going to talk about something I did literally before I walked into a session is before I walked into a session, I thought about all my biases and all my issues that I have with certain clients and whatnot. And I would imaginarily kind of grab them and physically show that I'm just taking them out of my head and dropping them on the ground. I'll leave them there until I'm done. And then I walked into the therapy room. It was kind of a ritual I had because I always knew that I came into a situation with biases, which we'll go over in much more detail, and we've got to be careful of those, and really, but it's only through complete acceptance of who we are as individuals that we can get to that point. Okay, so this is something we need to come to the treatment setting with and ready to engage with. Okay. So, so I mentioned the behavioral approach. And again, I'm just going to kind of go over these because now we're getting kind of into treatment modalities for this. So the first one was about humanistic, was about the relationship. This is kind of some of the techniques that we use. Of course, one of the most popular is what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is where again, we identify individuals' triggers to their symptoms, their behaviors, and then whether those are rewarded or punished, and then their future behaviors. That predicts their future behaviors. Okay. And then we get into thought processes where it's a trigger, thought, behavior, and then we appraise it. And so this is more on the mental end of how we evaluate life. But I know I'm kind of cutting this one short on this because we'll go into these in much more detail when we go through different types of groups. This is just kind of an outline of the different types of treatment that is most um, done. So when we combined the cognition and behavior, we have a thought, behavior, reinforcement, evaluation, and then we have an appraise. Again, that goes into then how we will think about that situation in the future. Okay. All right. And this is just kind of, again, the most popular approach is CBT, is widely used. Thoughts, emotions, and behavior. This model suggests that distorted or irrational thinking patterns really contribute to things from addiction to depression to anxiety to even post-traumatic stress. So the goal is to, again, identify, challenge, replace negative thought patterns. Tying this back to humanistic theory, we can't get to this point until we unbiasedly understand the client's perceptions, ideas, thoughts, beliefs about what's going on. Okay. So that's one form of treatment, and again, we'll go over these in much more detail. Another example of treatments is what's called dialectical behavior therapy. Um, This was mainly developed for people with borderline personality disorder, and includes things like self-harm. It's been used for substance abuse and emotional deregulation, especially with people, for example, who have bipolar. This works very well for. And what this combines is the cognitive behavioral approach that we just talked about, but also things like mindfulness, keeping in the moment, and distress tolerance, at what level of distress that we can handle in a given crisis, and what we should do when something exceeds our tolerance level. Okay. Uh, uh, um, uh, DBT also talks about emotional regulation and interpersonal effectiveness. And again, when we go over emotional intelligence, these are two main components of development. Okay. Um, this type of treatment is highly structured and skill based. And we focus in the group setting, we focus on teaching and practicing these skills. So we do a lot of, in DBT and group settings, we do a lot of role play. Okay. And so that's an example of that therapy. Okay. Existential therapy, again, this came from Viktor Frankl, Rollo May, John Pay Sater, really just focusing on what's known as existential crises, okay, and talking about the ultimates of life, like death and mortality, freedom and responsibility, isolation and relationships, and the meaning and purpose of life, and giving a person kind of that um, way to go about understanding their world. And then there's brief type of treatments, and I'll let you guys kind of read about these in the textbook, but I just wanted to kind of bring these up as different types of therapies. Okay. All right. I think right here is a good place to end, because on Thursday we can get into this general model of helping and really explore that, now that we've kind of gone over a few theories and briefly, and I know I did it very briefly, went over some types of treatment. And I'd encourage you to go back into the textbook or in the thing and kind of look at those and become a little bit more familiar with them. But I don't want to, but we will talk about them in more depth near the end of the semester when we go over different types of groups.